Welcome to the Baker Institute's webinar today. I'm Steve Lewis, the Starr Transnational China Fellow here at the Baker Institute. I'm the head of our China Studies program. We're very happy to have you all this afternoon, so I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. I'm hoping that not only do you find it very informative and unique insights by especially by my colleague, Dr. Kokas, but also a welcome respite from domestic politics, which of course is never as important as Asian affairs and Chinese politics. So just to start us off, I'd like to thank all of you again, our staff here, hardworking staff here at the Baker Institute, especially Laura Hotze, my research assistants, especially Kelly Liao for helping prepare, the C.V. Starr Foundation for endowing a lot of the events and positions here, but especially Dr. Kokas, Dr. Aynne Kokas. She is gosh, I've known her for 10 years now. I would say one of our top media studies scholars. I think it's been 10 years.
Yeah.
I've known her since she was a postdoc here at the Chao Center for Asian Studies, and being both China hands and interested in media, we hit it off, I think, quite early, and we've had Dr. Kokas and her expertise in many of our past webinars on Chinese politics and political reform, and we're very happy to have her again today. And also particularly happy this year because she is newly minted as an associate professor, a tenure professor at the Department of Media Studies at University of Virginia. And so the only other thing I can say before letting Dr. Kokas take over would be just to point out that in the public chat section, I put in some links to a lot of our Baker Institute publications, also a book by Dr. Kokas. So if you want to click on those, I will refer to them. But also you might find them interesting, to have on the end on the webinar as well. And I'll encourage everybody to go ahead and save questions you might have until the end. We're going to ask Dr. Kokas to speak for maybe 15 to 20 minutes. Then I will talk for maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And the topic, as you can tell from the title, is fairly straightforward. Most of us have been following the news, and we hear a lot about the so-called hard power, politics, military security studies, and things like this in the U.S.-China relationship. You can read a lot about Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, all of those things. Our program at the Baker Institute for 24 years now, since 1996, we've been taking a different take and looking at the growth of a Chinese middle class, how it relates to China's political system, what that means for things like energy, consumption, and of course, media. And so we like to style ourselves as a program that does original and timely and hopefully policy useful research on media and political communication in China. And so that's why we're going to be talking about the so-called soft power side of culture, media, and these types of interactions, including public diplomacy. So I'd like to ask Dr. Kokas to start us off and talk about her research and what that kind of tells us about this so-called contest, maybe between the U.S. and China in soft power.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, and many thanks to Laura Hotze and the Baker Institute staff for all of their amazing work on this event. I'd also like to thank the Abe Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council, which are funding my research this year, and Eileen Zhang for her amazing assistance with putting together this presentation, and so many others. And so today I'll be talking about how China's expanding. Oh, and one other thing that I really want to note here is, even though I'm not back actually in Texas, I feel spiritually back in Texas for this lone hour, and it brings me a lot of joy. I won't get the benefit of having good Mexican food, but it's wonderful to be culturally back at the Baker Institute. So one thing that I will, especially since this is a soft power panel, we should talk about these things that attract. So I did want to talk about China's expanding media clout, or expanding clout in the media and entertainment industries, as well as the tech sectors, and how that's ultimately shaping its overall vantage point as a global arbiter of soft power. Now, this is actually happening in a really interesting backdrop. So on one hand, we're seeing China's ascension. In 2020, for the first time ever, China is poised to have the biggest box office in the world, largely due to the US pulling back because of the coronavirus. We're also seeing for the first time Chinese platforms taking a really significant global leadership role, as in the case of TikTok, which we've seen a lot of controversy here in the US for. So 2020 has really been a significant inflection point for the Chinese media and technology industries, where we've seen a lot of the promise of the growth of the Chinese media and tech industries actually start to take hold. And this is actually occurring with a backdrop of the US having to pull back in a lot of areas, largely because of COVID-19. So it's a really interesting shift, and we'll see if this is actually a long-term inflection point, but we have definitely seen a shift, at least in this balance of power in 2020. Now, as we've seen, the US is rather chastened in terms of its ability to push back against Chinese data gathering and Chinese tech investment in the US context. So, for example, US efforts to block Chinese consumer data gathering on TikTok and the Wechat ban have been stymied by both commercial and legal pressures. The US is facing competition from a Chinese market where consumers have largely resumed pre-COVID commercial activity as US cases rise. And also, we've seen, because of Chinese protectionism within its technology sector, and to a lesser degree its media sector, this moment where there are a lot of really viable Chinese technology products that are emerging, both in hardware and in consumer applications. And these are tools that other countries are really interested in using. A lot of them are inexpensive. So we've seen a lot of global angst about the adoption of, for example, Huawei technologies in global 5G networks, and there's a logic for that. For a lot of countries, it's unclear that the US products would offer them greater security, and the Huawei products are cheaper. Now, this is an area of tremendous controversy, so I'm just going to throw that out there as a bomb and allow us to talk about it in the Q&A. Today, what I'll be talking about primarily is the evolution of China's relationship with Hollywood, which is what I wrote my book, Hollywood Made in China, about. And then I'll also be talking about a little bit about my new project, which is called Data Trafficking: How China Became the New Cyber Sovereigns, which looks at Chinese commercial data gathering within the US. So I'll be kind of exploring those two areas, but I'm very eager and very happy to talk about this kind of larger US-China tech war in the context of the Q&A. So within the media industries, what we see is that Beijing's economic clout allows it to insist that other countries comply with its censorship structures as a prerequisite to doing business in the country. So, for example, in the context of China's relationship with Hollywood, we see a situation where Hollywood studios are not necessarily in the position to push back against Beijing censorship demands if they want to still get their products into China. Now, this doesn't just apply to individual movies that are trying to enter into the market. This also applies to anything that studio does. So we've seen actually studios pull back from different projects that they've been interested in or doing outside of the Chinese market because of concerns about what's happening in China. So this is a really kind of broad-based soft power, kind of turning US soft power on its head, where we see a situation where Hollywood, the traditional lever of US soft power, is now being used as a way for China to be able to control global narratives. And this is a really significant moment, a really significant inflection point. One of the ways that we see this happening, for example, was in the case of the recent film Mulan, where the film, and I talk about this in an op-ed that I wrote for the Washington Post last month, the film actually offers a narrative for why China should overtake its Western regions, and for why it's and which is something that it's actually doing right now in real time. So by making this argument for Chinese imperial power and the kind of lack of coherence and the lack of clarity and intelligence on the part of the Western peoples in China, Mulan, this Hollywood film, is actually making the same types of arguments that Chinese propaganda movies would make. However, it's doing so with the veneer of a Disney movie. It's very shocking to see, and at the same time, we also see in the case of Mulan this really interesting moment where Disney actually filmed part of the film in Xinjiang, a place where there are active human rights abuses. There are camps where people are being, depending on how people have variously called them concentration camps and re-education camps. But either way, it's people being taken from their families and stored and forced to stay in a government-controlled place for years at a time. And that is the site where Disney chose to film part of its film. So that in itself is also a sort of tacit approval of very controversial Chinese government policies and policies through which China is violating the human rights of its own people. So this is a really kind of shocking development in the overarching relationship between China and Hollywood. And the part that's even kind of more difficult to believe is that Disney really hasn't been held to account for this. We saw that the CFO, because of the Xinjiang human rights abuse scandal, the CFO came out and said that there was a problem with the Chinese market. But this was only after, because of the scandal being reported in the US, that the Chinese government instituted a media blackout, which constrained Mulan's box office. So essentially, the problem only began when Disney started to face financial consequences in the Chinese market. So we're really seeing Hollywood being very constrained by its ties to China, and that is only increasing as the US box office is unable to reopen due to concerns about COVID-19. Now, we did see Mulan, for example, and we are seeing other films being released on streaming platforms, but those are much lower returns. So in essence, we're seeing a dramatic shift toward Hollywood studios that must depend on global box offices outside of the U.S. if they're to make their long-term returns on investment. And most of these are publicly traded companies or subsidiaries of publicly traded companies. So it is really a significant economic question. We are seeing in DC some efforts to push back against this. So, for example, Texas Senator Cruz introduced something called the Scripty Act, which would prevent any kind of U.S. military funding for studio films that censor. But this is something that's very, very difficult to assess. We can't really know what a development team. So we don't know like what stories are being told and what stories aren't being told, because a lot of this is internal company information. Most of the time when things come out, it's because of a really egregious change. So for example, in the case of Top Gun, we saw that there was a Taiwan flag patch on Tom Cruise's jacket in the first film. In the remake, that film or that patch was mysteriously gone. So that's an issue where we see a very kind of clear difference. But if a film just isn't made, it's very difficult to know. The other example where we're able to see kind of clear examples of censorship was in the Sony Hack, where we actually read studio emails and could see that there was an effort to kind of pull back from certain types of content due to concerns about China. But this is a really thorny issue. I would argue that, and in the Q&A we can talk about some different solutions, but I think it is something that we need to keep an eye on. Now, another thing that we've seen is that Attorney General Barr has started to talk about these issues publicly, as has Secretary of State Pompeo. But again, the U.S. government doesn't have a great history of involvement in Hollywood. In fact, it recalls back to many of our very kind of dark xenophobic days. So in the Q&A and after this talk, I'd love to speak with Dr. Lewis about some ways that it's possible to actually address these very real concerns, but not enter a new era of McCarthyism, which also doesn't help to allay a lot of these issues. Now, within the tech landscape, what we see is that there's an increasing shift toward Chinese government control of any type of data that's being gathered by Chinese firms. So in June 2017, China implemented a cybersecurity law, which now acts as a baseline for a lot of present-day guidelines. This law requires that data is stored within China for Chinese firms, and that includes US firms that are operating in China. We also saw from the July 2020 Hong Kong National Security Law, as well as the July 3rd, 2020 draft data security law, an increase in extraterritorial enforcement of Chinese laws, particularly as they relate to data security. So when we think about Chinese firms operating in the US, there's increasing pressure from the Chinese government for that data to be stored in China. And once it's stored in China, it must be stored in Chinese government-run servers as part of the 2017 cybersecurity law. So this is a further way through which this kind of seeming soft power effort, so something like TikTok, when we first look at it, appears to be a kind of soft power effort where it enhances the popularity of Chinese brands, for example. It actually also has a really significant hard power element because it can also serve as a data gathering function that serves very real hard power benefits for the Chinese government in terms of intelligence gathering, in terms of modeling, in terms of AI modeling, in terms of developing new tools for mis and disinformation, etc. So this is a really interesting area that we're seeing a lot of movement on. I've only given you a couple of examples of how the Chinese government is moving on this legally, but there are actually a lot of additional specifications and guidelines that relate directly to data gathering, both domestically in China and outside of China. The problem is, much like with the entertainment industry, it's very difficult within the context of a US free market system to constrain the activity of Chinese firms that are doing this. So much like in the case of Hollywood studios, one of the strengths of the US tech ecosystem is its openness. Much like one of the strengths of Hollywood is its openness to new ideas. So constraining that and constraining investment from different countries or constraining different partners from joining in has the potential to dampen the US innovation ecosystem. So for example, we saw a lot of pushback against the bans for TikTok and Wechat, both commercially and illegally. And a lot of that has to do with the fundamentals of the US system. Those types of bans don't work within this system. So again, we can talk about this in greater detail in the Q&A. I think that there's really a need for more comprehensive national data security regulations in the US that wouldn't necessarily just apply to China or wouldn't just apply in a national security context. Now, fundamentally, what we're seeing is that we're in the middle of what many have argued is a emerging or emerged Cold War between the US and China, both in the tech landscape as well as in other trade areas. However, the significant challenges that our two economies are heavily entwined, and the strengths of the US economy are its ability to absorb different types of influences, different capital, different ideas, and use that as a driver of innovation. So cutting off our trade relationship with China also prevents significant growth within the US. So we're in a very challenging moment, particularly in the context of the media and tech industries, where it's not just about products, but it's also about ideas. And the US is also in a challenging moment because we're having a relatively slow recovery from the coronavirus, and indeed are just across the street from where this would be held at the Texas Medical Center. The cases are rapidly increasing and putting a strain on Texas and other places. So reinvigorating the economy and reinvigorating these sectors necessarily comes second to making sure that everyone stays healthy and safe during this difficult time. So on that cheerful note, I will yield to Professor Lewis, and I really look forward to speaking in greater detail about ways that we can work through this, things that we can discuss with policymakers, common sense solutions that allow us to work through this relatively constrained challenge with the US-China media and tech sectors. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anne. I always learn so much from you, and I look forward to also having our discussion with the audience in the Q&A section. So my task then is to talk a little bit about wolf warrior diplomacy, which I think probably a lot of people in the United States are not familiar with the term. Wolf warrior refers to a Chinese film that came out in 2015. It's kind of a Chinese version of SEAL Team 6, an elite, paramilitary police unit of heroes and snipers and stuff who do all kinds of heroic things. And it was very successful. So much so there was a second one, and I believe there's a third one in the making, and some of the highest grossing ones. And but basically, think of it as like kind of unfettered, unapologetic, nationalism, testosterone-driven nationalism. And one of the things that's happened in the last year or so is that Chinese diplomats, who by and large, I would say, for the last 40, 50 years, have been fairly quiet, fairly stayed, cookie cutter type diplomats. They repeat the government line. They don't stray very far from that. They seem very cautious. They work a lot behind the scenes, including with Chinese citizens overseas. They work with Chinese diaspora wherever they can. They're fairly active, but they don't do that much, openly, and especially in the media. They tend to let the traditional state media handle a lot of that. But in the last year or so, there have been, several prominent cases of Chinese diplomats in high-profile places like Canada, UK, Europe, speaking out quite openly on Twitter, which is utterly remarkable since Twitter is actually banned in China. But Twitter is where there's increasingly, especially under the Trump administration, more and more public officials feel compelled, to speak out, and everything from President Trump to State Department officials. Secretary Pompeo is quite active on Twitter. American diplomats, have felt compelled to have more of a Twitter presence. And then individual members of Congress. Dan Crenshaw in our area is very active on Twitter. Famously, AOC in New York area is also. So basically, it's the Chinese diplomats seem to have responded and become quite aggressive in the sense of, individually like arguing with people, retweeting things, including conspiracy theories about the pandemic, and just punching back very aggressively, one can say. And it's drawn a lot of, comments and concern, I would say, particularly, I would say amongst Western diplomats who are wondering if this is a sign of the times. Is it a sign of more aggressive diplomacy by the Chinese government? Whenever I'm looking to see, is there a list of some of the more egregious comments? All I have to do is look back through my emails, because the director of the Baker Institute, Ambassador Region, every time he reads something that he finds utterly outrageous that's put out by Chinese diplomats, he sends me a copy of it. And that's pretty much common for people I know at State Department too, who are like, I can't believe the Chinese government is doing this. So let me talk a little bit about where I think this is coming from, because it is very much tied to the Chinese government kind of letting its media organs, and in particular these kind of quasi-state, quasi-private media organs, develop personalities, and so that these diplomats can kind of tie into that. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's been a big change in diplomacy, public diplomacy for China to do this. But it's also been because there's been a big change in propaganda. So let me just talk a little bit about that. And I'll play kind of like the old-timey guy role here, because in the 1980s, when I graduated from Ohio University School of Journalism in '85 with a degree in journalism, and promptly found out that because of the recession in America in the middle '80s, there were no jobs for journalists, I thought, well, maybe I can at least work on my Chinese. And so I went to China, began to teach English. But after a year, one of the things that opened up was a possibility to work as a copy polisher at Xinhua, which is the New China news agency for full public disclosure for my any future security clearances, technically I worked for the Chinese propaganda organ for 2 months in, I believe it was summer of 1986. And it was because at that time they actually had, I worked in the section called Domestic News for Foreign Consumption. And they had 4 editors. 3 of the editors had advanced degrees in journalism from American journalism colleges. And so this is 1985 before Tiananmen, when there was big reforms going on and a lot of experimentation, including letting newspapers compete with each other and print things that disagreed with the government. And as a part of that, I had friends who knew friends who knew friends. Of course, that's how it works in China. But they said, oh, can you come to Xinhua and you can kind of help work with our reporters on teaching them what is Western-style journalism. And at the same time, you kind of polish our stories and make them more understandable to a foreign audience, which was a bit of a chore because, things like they would put out a story that said, we've done our first ever survey of People's Liberation Army officers, and 10,243 of them support the direction of economic reforms. And so I asked them, I said, okay, what percentage of that? They say, oh, we don't have a percentage. But isn't that a good thing? I go, not unless it's a very small percentage of officers one might consider. So they ended up pulling that story. But they were trying to develop more Western style journalism, I would suppose, more independent or autonomous journalism. This is all before Tiananmen. So not surprisingly, in 1989, all of that was shut down. All the editors I knew were fired, if not investigated. But back in those days, China had a very much kind of a very brute force propaganda machine, not very subtle. A lot of the outdoor advertising that existed at the time was big slogans in bright red letters, telling people to do this, telling people to do that, that kind of thing. And the government very tightly controlled all of the state media, newspapers in particular, because the so-called Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s brought out factional fighting in the middle of the Communist Party, and a lot of it was sparked by and used by journalists, and Shanghai newspapers in particular. And ever since then, the central government has been very careful to keep an eye on Shanghai newspapers and competing newspapers. So, throughout the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s, the central government was always very clear to keep a very tight eye on journalists and the so-called state media. But then one thing began to happen in the 1990s was quite significant, is the government began to open up more. It began to slowly privatize, allow for more private competition, but it also wanted to downsize. So Premier Zhu Rongji in the 1990s, he said, well, one of the things we need to do is every government unit needs to cut 15% of their staff, because the bureaucracy had been booming and budgets were going up. So they did, like actually the United States, this happened as well. They said, well, tell every agency you need to downsize your staff. So actually, in the same way that NASA, many American agencies began to downsize in the 90s, so did Chinese government agencies, including the propaganda organs. They had to cut all these people. So what did they do? They went to the highest paid people, the older people, and they said, can we offer you early retirement? And so they offered people these early retirement packages. They retired. But then they found out, much like we did here with NASA, that all of these people that you've just let go were actually the ones who knew a lot about how to run things. So you ended up rehiring them again as independent consultants. So you ended up lowering the amount of bureaucrats. In China's case, you lowered the amount of propagandists, but you ended up increasing your budget because now you were paying them private industry wages. And in propaganda, one thing it meant was that you began to have a merger between propaganda agencies began to turn into advertising companies or public relations companies. And so, in China today, they still refer to the Chinese Communist Party as a propaganda department. And in Chinese, the term has been the same. They now call it government relations or public relations when they use it in English, but it's still the same propaganda department. And what's interesting about that is the government is a very large consumer of public relations and advertising. And all that began in the 1990s. You pushed out all of these people, and then you began to contract work and hire these people instead. So, in the 1990s, they were actually the Chinese government in the run-up to, WTO in 1999, 2001, they actually were also privatizing and following a lot of the Washington consensus. And after 2000, here in the Bush administration, China opened up even more to the global economy. Internet begins to become a thing. The Chinese government decided early on that we needed to control web search engines, the influence of foreign social media. So foreign journalists, foreign media distribution was tightly restricted. The Great Firewall, was set up to isolate. And under WTO, media and cultural things are not included, under WTO agreements. So China did join the global economy by ceding to the WTO, but much of that did not include, things like the Chinese state media. Towards the end of the 90s and early 2010s, Hu Jintao, the party secretary, actually began a policy of let's do in many sectors, but let's do what seems to work well in other sectors, and that is let's expand the Chinese state media enterprises, and under the notion of the so-called media aircraft carriers. And so they made a huge investment in updating the state media, including the newspapers. And around this time, they began to say, well, instead of just having the old People's Daily, Liberation Daily, all of these old traditional ones, let's also create things like Global Times, which is a more tabloid style, and put it under the direction of an editor who obviously is approved by government media organs to play that role, but it's somebody who is a little more critical, but also who knows Western media quite well and whose English is quite good. So if you look for Global Times, you can still see that every now and then, both on Twitter and on the net, you'll see its editor Hu Xijing will have little talks called Who Says, where he's talking about things. It's very kind of folksy. It's very savvy, and he likes playing that role of kind of an interlocutor. But that said, most of what they do very tightly supports the Chinese government line. It has a little more latitude to publish things that are critical of failures, usually by local government officials, not central government officials in China. But that mainly began under Hu Jintao. Of course, Xi Jinping, the current party leader and president of China, came in 2012, 2013. And with him, and he kind of inherited this initiative to try to update China's media and pushed it even forward. So even things like China Daily, which is the straight up English language version of People's Daily from China, they said, well, let's sell this in the United States. So here in Houston, for example, you could get the Houston Chronicle for a while would have 2 or 3 editions each week of China Daily printed in English. And the Houston Chronicle welcomed this greatly because the Chinese government, Chinese Daily, was paying them to publish these things. So I believe there's 6 editions of this. They're no longer, I don't think, really operating, and they found out very few people were interested in subscribing. But it earned them a lot of respect and I would say support from American newspapers, which are very much hurting. Even the Chinese theoretical journal called Qiu Shi decided to come up with an English language version. And I've yet to meet anybody other than a political scientist who actually prescribed this. They also, at the same time, there's also the growth of Chinese public opinion and public survey ones. So contrary to what we think about, the communist parties as being stodgy, unable to change, largely because of the privatization that happened in the 90s, the Chinese propaganda organs became very commercially competitive, and part of that was also that they would tie in with public opinion polling and surveys. So Horizon Survey Research, a very large public opinion survey research firm, started privately under its very kind of entrepreneurial man who led it, Yuan Yue, who we've also worked with doing surveys. But they did surveys for the American government in China. They did surveys for the Chinese government. There were times when different ministries under the central government were competing to outdo each other and replace each other. They would do surveys for each one of those, showing how bad the other one was doing. It's kind of a Wild West style, thing about public polling, but remarkably, the Chinese Communist Party is very interested in what is going on. I think polling has gone down a little bit in China because now they can monitor social media. So in the last 10 years, they can get a much better sense for what's going on in China just by following social media. So Facebook is banned, but they have Wechat. And Weibo, which is kind of like basically the blogs that they had in China traditionally, has been kind of replaced by Wechat. But they use a lot of the same tactics that they used in the 90s and afterwards with the so-called Weibo, the so-called blogs of you keep a close eye on people who become popular, you restrict the accounts, and then you also hire people called Wu Mao, which means 50 cents. So the government would pay people to post things that were supportive of what it wanted to do and pay them 50 cents. So Wu Mao is kind of a notion for that. It's changed more recently because China is one of the world leaders in adaptive intelligence, artificial intelligence. And so a lot of these functions have become backed up by AI, but they still have these so-called Wu Mao behind the scenes. If you look at I can give you a very clear example of this. If you look at the most recent Baker Institute blog by my research associate, Brandon Jung, it came out on Friday, and it's talking about a controversy very much related to soft power. And this is where anime, we know, is very popular in Japan, but also the rest of the world with young people. And as a result of this, a company called HoloLive, they hired actresses basically to imitate very popular anime stars and then do weekly on YouTube or other platforms, meetings with their fans, and where they would pretend to be this anime character interacting with their fans. And it's usually very witty, it's kind of charming, kind of like almost like an updated geisha in a way, kind of that kind of format. And one of the things they found out very recently was 2 of the stars on there mentioned Taiwan, and it provoked a huge reaction amongst very nationalistic Chinese young people. And one of the things that Brandon writes about in this piece is that counterintuitively, even though some of these stars were based in China and the Japanese original company was trying to move towards the Chinese market because it was a very large market, they ended up pulling out and going more towards the American market. And so they're kind of in the same boat that a lot of, like the NBA is in, like a lot of global entertainment companies, is they're trying to decide, well, how much do we want to be involved in the Chinese market? So anyway, my colleague wrote this piece. He put it out it was published on Friday afternoon. He and I both put it on Twitter with all these hashtags. And I think within 2 days, he had 1,600 engagements on Twitter. And already something like, we guess maybe around 10 or so, either Umaos or a combination of Umao and Twitter bots were reacting and, criticizing him, passive aggressively saying things about him, complimenting him on his hairstyle, but also criticizing his knowledge of China and all these things. And one of the things that we decided to do was that since they basically were harassing, both of us reported to Twitter that this was harassment, and Twitter shut it down instantly. Probably because Twitter could see very clearly that these were bots. At least a large one were bots. It had very few followers. They responded instantly, and they retweeted each other. So it kind of suggests a new model of harassment, where you maybe have some nationalistic youth, but they're backed up by government Twitter bots, trying to back up what they do. And this is all part of the new strategy for how can China reach out and engage in the Twitter sphere, which it realizes is quite important in other countries, especially its markets or its competitors like the United States. And so this, I think, kind of explains if they're letting, young Chinese people kind of speak out, trash talk other people around the world on Twitter, which is still banned in China, but people have a way of getting through this. It kind of suggests, I think, why they're letting diplomats do the same thing. The diplomats can kind of safely do it because most people in China aren't going to see it, but the diplomats know that they are vying for things that are mentioned on Twitter. One of the other things I think that it also kind of explains why Chinese diplomats may have gone more wolf warrior recently I would say is that the quality of Chinese diplomats has been greatly increased over the last 10 or 15 years. When I came to Houston 24 years ago, I ended up meeting some people from cultural education attaches from the Chinese consulate, of course, wanted to meet people from Rice. And I was really not impressed with their quality. I have a name that I use in Chinese, Liu Chengyi, and I wrote my name on my business card in traditional Chinese characters. And one of the characters is pretty unusually difficult. But people from Taiwan, Hong Kong who use traditional Chinese characters can recognize it. And as a lot of these meetings went, the young cultural attaché from the Chinese consulate started lecturing me about how little I knew about Chinese language and culture and customs. And this was the line that you ignorant foreigners need to listen to us. And I gave him my card, and he started to read my name, and he stopped. And because he didn't recognize the character. So he obviously hadn't had a particularly good education in traditional Chinese. But I would say that that's very unusual today. I would suspect that any of the new generation of diplomats they've hired are not only very well trained in Chinese culture and traditional things, but very well trained in English and other languages. Part of this, I would say, has a lot to do with individual leaders in the Chinese government. So one of the most influential people in Chinese diplomacy is a man named Yang Jiechi. Tiger Yang, as some people have called him. He was the ambassador to the U.S., he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's currently a state counselor on the government side, but he's a member of the Politburo, which is quite rare in Chinese history to have somebody responsible for foreign affairs. His English is excellent. He was trained at LSE and UK universities in the 70s. He got to know a whole generation of American leaders in the 70s and 80s, from when President Bush and even Secretary Baker were in China and visiting China in the 1970s. And so this one particular diplomat who's very, very savvy in English and in being, all the type of, subtle negotiating styles and everything like this, I believe he probably very likely also played a role in training a whole new generation of people. And one of the things that's unusual about this time is that particular leader, Yang Jiechi, he's 70 years old. So he won't be able to continue forward into the next, generation of leaders. And so there's probably a lot of people kind of vying to replace him or replace the role that he has played, but recognizing that public diplomacy has also moved into the Twitter sphere. And kind of the last thing I want to mention about that is about 8 or 9 years ago, I went to a conference which was sponsored by the United Nations looking at global issues and how can we look at these issues. And I presented research looking at public advertising in different countries, including the US and China. But there were a lot of Chinese media scholars who were there. And one of the things they were looking at was American virtual public diplomacy. So, I'm not sure the exact status of it today, but in the 1990s, there was a program at State Department where you would get American college students to be virtual diplomats. Kind of from the United States, but interacting on Weibo and other Chinese social media and answering questions about anybody who went to the American embassy's webpage. And anyway, these Chinese researchers said, well, let's study this. Let's look at who's interacting with them, who's doing all of this. And they reported, that this type of diplomacy they thought was immensely successful. They said that the Chinese people who were interacting, especially young people, found it very, very fascinating, and they really enjoyed it. They didn't always believe everything the American students would say, but they found it utterly fascinating. And it also kind of related to my experience at the American Pavilion at the Shanghai Expo in 2010, where American college students acted as guides in the expo. And if you talk to any Chinese people, they would say, well, we really didn't like the expo. It had a lot of American propaganda, but the American guides, the American college student guides, were just amazing. They were really fun. They were timely. They were teaching them slang, teaching them how to say awesome, and all these like American kind of college slang. And so Chinese researchers 8 or 9 years ago latched onto the fact that young people in particular were responding to much more direct, type of, interactive type of public diplomacy virtually. And so and one of the things they did was they told the Chinese diplomats, you need to emulate this. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs shut them down. But I think eventually they succeeded. And this probably is the result of this, is the Chinese diplomats thinking, maybe we can interact more. It also probably suggests that there must be some mechanisms to try to trust these particular diplomats. And it seems to be a trend that this more aggressive diplomacy will continue, because one of the ambassadors who did it, Zhao Lijian, is now the main spokesman, the director of the news office back at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing, who's brought back to Beijing and put in charge of it. I'll just end with a little bit of comments about does it seem to be succeeding? And so far, it's really not clear. There doesn't seem to be an awful lot of interaction other than with foreign journalists, foreign diplomats, and people who are kind of outraged by it. But news sources don't seem to be picking up. This whole strategy of Mao and trolls also seems to be not succeeding. There have been studies showing that it doesn't seem to transfer very well. Not to mention Twitter is onto it, and Twitter shuts them down fairly quickly. It's very good at recognizing bots. Now, they're nowhere near sophisticated as, say, the Russian ones. And so whether that will change, I don't know. The Chinese government thus far has relied more on Wechat, which is a Chinese language media. And Wechat is the one that the Trump administration wants to ban. But Wechat is very much structured in a way to keep groups small and to keep an eye on what people say in it, and even to block, to censor what's going on, because the Chinese government is, as much as it might like people overseas using Wechat to counter the American government or other governments, it's more afraid of Wechat being used against the Chinese government. And it has a long history of being afraid of young people in particular protesting against foreigners, either on the street or virtually in China, and having that turn into criticism of the Chinese government. And so far, at least, Chinese propaganda hasn't kept up, except for these groups of diplomats who've transferred over to Twitter. So, as usual, I went too long. But I think that kind of explains why that this seems to be more influential. And of course, the Chinese, both the diplomat individuals, but also companies are very inventive and very creative. So I have no doubt that they will change and try to find new ways to be influential going forward. So with that, maybe we can, I don't know if there's something you wanted to talk about in particular, Anne, but otherwise we can turn it over and start looking at questions.
Well, I think we should take some of these fantastic questions we have. I mean, it looks like there's some great stuff here. So do you want to, I see a question from Chris Bronk from the University of Houston.
I think you need to take that.
I think so.
Our former colleague who's now at University of Houston, and who also played a role in the virtual diplomacy program at the State Department.
Yeah, so he's a leader in this field, so it's a pleasure to see him on. So Chris's question is, Hollywood can be activist at times regarding human rights. Are there individuals or groups mobilizing on the Uyghur issue in the U.S. or Western entertainment industry? Now, this is a really great question, and I'd like to thank Professor Bronk for that. Great question. So one thing that's really interesting is in the 90s, we saw a lot of activism around Tibet and around and even into the early 2000s around Tibet and China's response to Tibet. And we have actually seen that stars that were involved in that activism have kind of stepped back from their role in Hollywood. And one activist, Richard Gere, has actually made a lot of effort to kind of push back against Hollywood studios for not casting him, or concerns that he's not being cast because of his Tibet activism. Now, fast forward another 20 years, and we see the situation of Xinjiang with the kind of mass concentration camps in China of over estimates of over 1 million people being detained, and we see far less, in fact, almost no response. We have seen the only response that we've seen has been from people who have no shot at getting their movies into China. independent producers. So, for example, Judd Apatow, some of you he was famous for a lot of films, one of which is The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Spoiler alert, that film is not ever going to get past Chinese censors. So by speaking out against Hollywood, or by speaking out against China's relationship with Xinjiang, he's not losing out on the chance to distribute his films in China. The kind of silence has really been deafening, given what we've seen in Hollywood studios as, efforts to kind of promote social justice domestically. And it really unfortunately emphasizes how performative a lot of those efforts to enhance social justice are, because of the very little response that we're seeing in response to Xinjiang. So thank you very much for that great question, Chris. And Steve, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, that's great. I see we have a couple other questions about, kind of related to COVID, also about other American politicians, including senators and Congress people, who have bills proposed by, it's usually Senator Cruz or Senator Rubio, but more recently it's also Senator Hawley from Missouri and Senator Cotton, who have various degrees of things about, should we eliminate Confucius Institutes altogether at American universities? And I think one thing I think that's interesting to note about that is, I think the kind of the tax on Confucius Institutes is a little misplaced, although maybe justifiable, because the Chinese government doesn't really allow us, the American government, to have so-called American institutes on its campuses anymore. And Ambassador Branstad, who used to be Governor Branstad, very publicly pushed the Chinese universities on this, to the point where they said, you can't come and visit these American institutes. So kind of making it very, very clear that the Chinese government wanted us to have these Confucius Institutes, American universities, teaching, Chinese language and things like this, cultural and educational things, but they didn't want American government to be able to do the same thing on Chinese university campuses. And I actually supported what Ambassador Branstad did, because I think we need to return to the notion of reciprocity. The same thing with the State Department has been kicking out Chinese state journalists and putting restrictions on their movement. And as unfortunate as it is to restrict, media, the Chinese government has been doing this for a very long time. And the same thing, and to some degree, with WeChat and TikTok as well. It seems it's not clear whether or not the administration actually has the ability to do this legally. There's court cases looking at this, but the Chinese government is in no real position to criticize other people for, disadvantaging or treating badly any Chinese media, when it won't allow any foreign media to operate freely within China as well. So my understanding of this is, what's probably best would be for the United States to join with other countries and to tell the Chinese, look, let's sit down and discuss, all of these things, whether it's a Confucius Institute at a university, or whether it's media, or film, distribution of cultural products and things like this. We need to negotiate this and return to some notion of reciprocity, because the Chinese government has been exploiting this. And if it isn't the Chinese government, it's Chinese companies have been exploiting the fact that they have these advantages where they can operate exclusively in the Chinese market and keep out foreign media companies. But Anne, I don't know if you had some comments, kind of related to that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything that you're saying about the need to really recognize what the reciprocal relationship is. And there are definitely areas where it's possible for the US government to take a kind of harder line, not necessarily even a harder line, but a more equal line in terms of how the Chinese government interacts with certain entities. I see a great question from Paulo Menecheli, from an upcoming China scholar from the University of Brasilia. So it's great to see the emerging scholars joining into this conversation. And one thing that he notes is, so I have written in the past about how the decentralization of the U.S. government allows for the growth of Chinese influence in certain sectors. Now, the challenge becomes what does one do in that situation? So I think one thing that we can work on is what Dr. Lewis was talking about, is identifying areas for potential, kind of reciprocal policies. Another thing that I think is really important to do is within the U.S. context, not necessarily to increase U.S. government control over the tech industry or Hollywood studios. I don't think that's a winning strategy. I think it's in some ways shooting ourselves in the foot, because these are industries that are already doing very well within the U.S. context. However, I think that there are great opportunities for more transparency in these industries. So in the context, for example, of Hollywood studios, more transparency about where funding comes from. So if it, who is funding films over a certain budgetary level, and reporting to that effect, I think could be one way that it's possible to track the way that influence operations work. Similarly, within the tech landscape, more transparency about investment and investment practices, and who is investing in startups, and who is investing, which companies are investing minority stakes. The challenge that the U.S. faces right now is there is a mechanism called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which allows the U.S. government to oversee foreign investment in U.S. firms, and it's now available for minority stakes. And it applies not just to China, but to a wide variety of different companies, not just to tech, but to a wide variety of different sectors. Now, the central issue that CFIUS faces is, first of all, a lack of manpower. So it's for the amount of investment that the U.S. encounters, it doesn't necessarily have enough scale. The other issue is data gathering and understanding what the central challenges are that individual companies face, and what potential levers are. So I think increasing the types of reporting requirements, particularly for public companies, and that's something that can be done in a relatively straightforward manner through the SEC, in terms of the types of foreign financing that they're receiving, particularly for strategic sectors, I think is one important direction to take. Another much more controversial recommendation, and unfortunately, this is also where a lot of the challenge lies, is how do we do this for private companies, for privately held firms? Because there are a lot of privately held companies in strategic industries that have very few reporting requirements, but can be heavily involved in strategic sectors. So I think that is, but again, this kind of comes up against a central challenge in the American system of, people, investors like having privately held companies for a reason. It's because they don't have to report publicly as much about what they're doing. So I don't know how feasible that is, but I think it's an important thing to think about as we move into an area of greater competition, particularly in strategic technology sectors.
I think there's also maybe I can just comment a little bit briefly. There's a question about China's involvement and its soft power initiatives and it being portrayed negatively. This is from Brandon Jung, our research associate. He said, to what extent is this purposeful and what are the unintended side effects? I don't know the extent at which it's purposeful, but the unintended side effect is that China is becoming increasingly unpopular. The Pew Global Research polls over the last half a year and everything showing that a lot of it has to do with COVID, but also what is viewed as a more aggressively naked hand of Chinese bullying. There's no other word for it. Bullying of diplomats and diplomatic communities, and most of it's not directed at the United States or the European powers as much. It's more directed at smaller countries that are mainly resource countries that are exporting. So Australia more recently, Canada, more kind of the bullying of those, and it's provoking a very strong, public reaction. And so China, was viewed very favorably, about a year ago, and is viewed as kind of an economic successor to the United States, but largely because of the pandemic and the way the Chinese government has behaved, it's been viewed very, very negatively. It's also worth pointing out, though, that the United States government has also been viewed very negatively. And one of the utterly remarkable things is that, 4 years ago, most of our allies in Europe and South Korea and Australia and Japan, we were like 70 to 80% approval ratings. If you ask them, do you approve what the American government is doing? Those are now more like 20 to 30% range. They have fallen very, very steeply in just the last 4 years. And there's one recent poll asking these countries, mainly our allies, our advanced industrial democracy allies, what do you think about these world leaders? And Angela Merkel, Macron, farther down was Boris Johnson. Then down below that was Putin. Then down below that was Xi Jinping, and then Donald Trump came in at 16% approval rating, which is just unbelievably low for an American president. So it doesn't really matter who the next president is going to be. They're obviously going to have to rebuild a lot of trust, and also rebuild trust amongst our allies and economic partners, in particular. But it's also worth noting the Chinese government has also suffered a lot of that. My own note there would be that I suspect the Chinese government is hoping that vaccine diplomacy will be something that it can leverage. It's already reached out to governments in South Asia in particular, including governments that have been, aggressive back towards it recently and said, hey, we can get you vaccines. And there hasn't been a corresponding type of initiative from the United States government, and especially as the U.S. government has distanced itself from the World Health Organization. So I think we're actually at about the time, but maybe, Anne, do you have any final comments, or maybe there's one more question you want to deal with? There's a lot of great questions here.
I know there's so many great questions. So I think I would just make a final comment about how in this moment of COVID, really from my perspective as a China scholar, the kind of the central feature of how well the U.S. is able to contend with China over the coming year is really how effectively the U.S. government is able to respond to this public health crisis, how comprehensively and how effectively. And that is really, that is the key to our economic competition. That's central to our ability to work with our allies and partners. If we're able to kind of recover and help other countries. So even though I focus on the media and tech sector, really all eyes from my perspective are on how can we most effectively manage this pandemic to regain our global status.
Great, thank you, Anne. I agree very much with that as well. I think that's going to be one of the major issues. So no matter which leadership we have in the United States going forward, they're going to have to deal with these issues. So, all right. Well, thank you very much to all of you who tuned in. A special thanks again to Dr. Kokas. And we look forward to having more in the future. We should also have some, my colleague Gabriel Collins has a piece coming out soon, I believe, looking at more of the hard power side. What should the government be, dealing with China and the Indo-Pacific? Another of our scholars, Daniel Katz, has a piece about military diplomacy, defense diplomacy. I can also direct your attention to our blog pieces, Andrew Wan on Wechat, the role of China in American elections. Andy Chen has a piece on that. And I think also those of you who are interested in media, check out Aaron Huang's dissertation at Harvard Kennedy School, looking at the mainland government's interference in the Taiwanese presidential elections versus social media and the accommodations they worked out with Facebook. There's all fascinating things going on in this whole area of hard power versus soft power, and we're happy to share our research with you. And thank you all for tuning in, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.